It was a warm summer morning in June 1892, when a man named Homer Plessy stepped onto a train platform in New Orleans. The sound of steam filled the air, the chatter of passengers echoed across the station, and yet, beneath that ordinary hum of life, history was quietly waiting to unfold. Plessy, dressed neatly and carrying the calm confidence of someone who knew the risks, purchased a first-class ticket to Covington, Louisiana. To most onlookers, he appeared like any other passenger. But this was no routine train ride. It was a carefully planned act of courage, one that would challenge the very foundation of America's laws and identity. Homer Plessy was not just another traveler. He was a man of mixed heritage, light-skinned enough to pass in a society obsessed with color, but determined not to. As he boarded the train and took his seat in the section reserved for white passengers, he made a silent statement to the world: injustice could no longer be ignored. Moments later, when the conductor asked if he was a man of color, Plessy answered truthfully. That one admission set everything in motion. He was ordered to move to another car. He refused. "I have paid for a first-class ticket," he said calmly. "And I intend to ride in the first-class car." Within minutes, the train screeched to a halt. Plessy was arrested, handcuffed, and taken to jail, his only crime, sitting in the wrong seat. But behind that single act lay a deeper fight, one that would reach the Supreme Court and ultimately shape the next 70 years of racial segregation in America. The case that followed, Plessy vs. Ferguson, 1896, would give legal backing to the concept of separate but equal, a phrase that justified decades of inequality. This moment marked the beginning of the Jim Crow era, a system that divided, dehumanized, and defined generations. Yet, it also marked the rise of resistance, the courage of one man standing against an empire of hate. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we keep history alive and ensure that its lessons continue to echo through time. Before Homer Plessy ever set foot on that train in New Orleans, another man had already dared to challenge the same system, a man whose name history nearly forgot, Daniel Desdunes. His story began just 1 year earlier, in 1892, when Louisiana's new Separate Car Act had begun to take effect. The law demanded that railroad companies provide equal but separate accommodations for passengers, dividing them by race. To many, it seemed like just another law in a growing list of injustices. But to Desdunes, it was an opportunity to fight back, quietly but powerfully. Daniel Desdunes was part of a small but determined group known as the Citizens Committee, made up of local leaders in New Orleans, lawyers, educators, and activists who believed that equality must be tested in court, not just spoken about in the streets. They understood that the fight for dignity couldn't rely on emotion alone, it needed evidence, strategy, and bravery. Desdunes volunteered to be that first brave soul. On a cool February morning, he boarded a train bound for Mobile, Alabama. Like Plessy after him, he held a first-class ticket, and like Plessy, he sat deliberately in the car reserved for white passengers. To anyone watching, it was an ordinary scene, a man taking his seat, looking out the window, perhaps thinking about the journey ahead. But Desdunes wasn't traveling for comfort. He was traveling to make a point. When the conductor approached, Desdunes didn't hide who he was. He told the truth and waited for what he knew would come next. The arrest was swift, and soon he found himself in custody for violating the Separate Car Act. Yet, this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a legal test, one designed to expose the contradictions within the law itself. When the case reached court, something unexpected happened. The judge dismissed it, not because Desdunes was right or wrong, but because of a technicality. The journey he had taken crossed state lines, and the court ruled that interstate commerce was under federal jurisdiction, not state law. This meant Louisiana's segregation law didn't apply to his trip. The protest had ended not with a moral victory, but with a loophole. Still, the impact was undeniable. Desdunes' case, though dismissed, paved the way for Plessy. It showed the Citizens Committee how the courts might react, where the weaknesses in the law might lie, and what kind of evidence was needed to force the question that would eventually reach the Supreme Court. Des Dunes may not have changed the world that day, but he lit the spark that would guide others toward a greater challenge. Imagine the courage it took, to walk onto that train knowing arrest was certain, to face public humiliation and still hold your head high. Daniel Des Dunes never became a household name, yet without him, the more famous stand of Homer Plessy might never have been possible. History often remembers the heroes who win, but not the ones who lay the groundwork for their victories. Des Dunes was that kind of hero, a quiet fighter who proved that resistance isn't always loud or celebrated, but it's essential. His courage whispered the first notes of defiance that would echo through America for generations. When the Supreme Court announced its decision in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, it was more than a ruling, it was a declaration that would shape the destiny of millions. In a nation still struggling to heal from the wounds of the Civil War, the court's words landed like a heavy door closing on the promise of equality. By a vote of 7-1, the justices ruled that segregation was constitutional, as long as the separate facilities for black and white citizens were equal. But everyone knew that in practice, they never would be. That single phrase, separate but equal, became the legal foundation for an entire social order built on division. Overnight, it legitimized the walls that had already begun to rise across the American South. Schools, restaurants, train cars, hospitals, even public parks, all became battlegrounds of identity, governed by invisible lines drawn by fear and law. What had once been a collection of customs and unwritten rules suddenly gained the weight of the highest court in the land. For those who had fought so hard to secure their freedom just decades earlier, the decision felt like betrayal carved in marble. Generations of families who had once dared to hope now found themselves navigating a world that treated them as outsiders in their own homeland. The Reconstruction era's fragile dream of unity was replaced by a rigid system of separation, codified into local and state laws that came to be known as the Jim Crow system. In towns and cities across the South, new signs appeared, small wooden boards with stark words that divided water fountains, waiting rooms, and school entrances. But the true impact went far beyond signs. It was a psychological boundary, one that taught children from their earliest years where they could go, what they could do, and who they were allowed to be. The Plessy ruling gave moral cover to those who wanted the old order restored, those who believed the world should remain as it was before emancipation. Behind closed doors, lawmakers crafted new regulations designed to disenfranchise and control. Voting tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses ensured that political power remained in the same hands. And if anyone dared to resist, violence and intimidation waited in the shadows to enforce the message. The law, once meant to protect liberty, now became a tool to preserve hierarchy. The irony was cruel. The court had spoken of equality, yet it had drawn a boundary so deep it would take generations to cross. The Jim Crow system became not just a set of laws, but a way of life, an unspoken rulebook that governed where one could sit, learn, eat, or even dream. It seeped into culture, language, and everyday interactions, leaving scars that could not be seen but were deeply felt. And yet, even in those darkest years, resistance did not vanish. Quiet defiance grew in church basements, community meetings, and family conversations whispered late at night. People remembered Daniel Des Dunes and Homer Plessy, those who had dared to test injustice before it was fashionable to do so. Their courage lived on in the hearts of those who refused to believe that separation could ever be equal. The Plessy v. Ferguson decision was meant to bring order, but instead, it brought decades of unrest, a slow-burning struggle for dignity that would one day erupt into a movement. What began as a single man's protest on a Louisiana train became the spark for a national reckoning that would take nearly 70 years to undo. Long before the term Jim Crow appeared in law books or court rulings, it existed on stage, in music halls, traveling shows, and crowded theaters filled with laughter that hid a much darker truth. The name came from a character created by a white performer named Thomas D. Rice in the early 1800s, a man who would unknowingly give a face and a name to one of the most oppressive systems in American history. Rice was a struggling actor, moving from one small theater to another, searching for a way to capture audiences. One evening, as the story goes, he encountered an elderly black man singing a tune while working near the docks. The melody was rhythmic, full of life, and Rice saw in it something he could use. He took the song, exaggerated its tone, and built a character around it, a foolish, dancing caricature he named Jim Crow. When Rice stepped onto the stage, his face was covered in burnt cork to darken his skin. He wore tattered clothes, shuffled his feet, and spoke in distorted language meant to amuse white audiences. The crowd erupted in laughter. "Jump Jim Crow" became an instant hit, and Rice, once an unknown performer, turned into one of the most famous entertainers in America. He took his act across the country and even to Europe, where the image of Jim Crow became one of America's most recognizable exports. But beneath the applause was something sinister. The character of Jim Crow wasn't just entertainment, it was propaganda dressed as humor. It reduced an entire group of people to a stereotype, teaching audiences to see them not as individuals, but as caricatures to be mocked. The laughter reinforced prejudice, turning bigotry into a form of amusement that audiences paid to enjoy. Over time, the name Jim Crow escaped the theater and seeped into everyday speech. By the mid-19th century, the phrase had become a shorthand term for the idea of keeping black people in their place. Newspapers used it casually, politicians echoed it in speeches, and by the end of the century, when segregation laws began spreading across the South, those laws naturally inherited the name. What had started as a stage act had transformed into a national ideology. It's one of history's cruel ironies, that a song and a dance, once meant to make people laugh, evolved into a system that would shape American life for generations. The legacy of Thomas D. Rice's creation stretched far beyond the theater curtains. It helped solidify harmful myths that justified discrimination and inequality, giving them a name that sounded almost harmless. Jim Crow didn't sound like a threat, it sounded familiar, even folksy, and that was part of its power. Theaters eventually moved on to new trends, but the image Rice created refused to fade. It lingered in popular culture, in cartoons, songs, and political cartoons. The character of Jim Crow became a symbol, a reminder of how culture can influence the way a society sees itself and the people within it. By the time segregation laws were passed in the late 19th century, the phrase, Jim Crow, had already done its work. It provided the perfect label for a system that relied not only on law but on belief, on the idea that separation was natural, even entertaining. And so, the name of a stage character became the banner under which injustice marched. History rarely warns us where its symbols will lead. In the case of Jim Crow, a song meant to make audiences laugh became the soundtrack to nearly a century of suffering, a chilling testament to how mockery can evolve into policy, and how words meant in jest can leave scars that last for generations. Life under the Jim Crow system was not simply about separation, it was about control. It reached into every corner of daily existence, turning even the smallest gestures into quiet tests of obedience. From sunrise to sunset, Black Americans lived under a web of laws and unspoken rules that dictated how to move, how to speak, and even how to dream. Imagine walking into a town where every sign reminds you of what you are not allowed to do. Two water fountains stand side by side, one labeled for colored, the other for white. A park bench sits beneath a tree, but only certain people are permitted to rest there. Schools are divided by fences, restaurants by entrances, and neighborhoods by invisible lines that everyone understands but no one needs to explain. It wasn't only about where one could sit or eat, it was about who was allowed to feel human. The rules went far beyond written law. They were enforced through a culture of expectation, a system where a misplaced glance or a word spoken too casually could lead to humiliation, or worse. A black man was expected to step aside when a white man passed on the sidewalk. A black woman could not look directly into the eyes of a white person without risking accusation of insolence. Even the simplest acts of dignity, speaking firmly, dressing well, asserting equality, were seen as challenges to the social order. In the Jim Crow South, names and titles carried enormous weight. Black men were addressed by their first names, or worse, by dismissive nicknames, regardless of age or respect earned. In return, they were expected to use sir or ma'am when speaking to white individuals. It was a linguistic chain, subtle yet powerful, reinforcing who was supposed to command respect and who was expected to give it. Education, too, reflected the same cruel hierarchy. Schools for black children received only a fraction of the funding of white schools. Textbooks were hand-me-downs, buildings were crumbling, and teachers often worked with little more than faith to sustain them. Yet within those classrooms grew a quiet resilience. Children learned not just to read and write, but to hope, to see knowledge as a form of resistance in a world that tried to limit their potential. Public transportation offered daily reminders of the divide. On trains and buses, rows of seats were separated not by comfort, but by color. A single step in the wrong direction could invite scorn, arrest, or worse. Many people carried the weight of constant vigilance, calculating every move, every word, every glance, because one small mistake could change everything. And yet, within this suffocating structure, communities found ways to survive and even thrive. Churches became sanctuaries, not only of faith but of freedom. Music became a voice for the voiceless. Families built networks of care and protection, quietly passing down lessons on how to endure, how to maintain dignity in a world determined to deny it. What made Jim Crow so devastating was not only the brutality of its laws, but the normalization of its customs. It was the way injustice disguised itself as order, the way inequality hid behind politeness and tradition. It created a world where people learned to navigate fear as if it were the weather, an ever-present condition, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, but always there. To live under Jim Crow was to live with constant awareness of the boundaries drawn around you. But it was also to live with an unbreakable will, the kind that grows in silence, beneath oppression, waiting for the day when those boundaries would finally begin to crack. Across the American South, the world of Jim Crow was written not only in prejudice but in law. Page by page, town by town, the machinery of segregation took shape through thousands of local and state statutes. These weren't abstract rules debated in distant capitals, they were everyday decrees, posted in shop windows, printed in newspapers, and enforced on the streets. Together, they created a map of restriction so detailed that every movement, every choice, seemed already decided before it was made. In one town, a law demanded that schools for black and white children be built miles apart, even if it meant long walks through dangerous roads. In another, train stations were required to build separate waiting rooms, each marked by crude wooden signs that left no doubt who belonged where. The laws extended into places few would think to regulate: restaurants, theaters, parks, libraries, hospitals, and even cemeteries. Life and death alike were governed by division. There were laws that forbade people from sharing a taxi, laws that required separate textbooks, and laws that punished businesses for serving customers of different races at the same table. A simple meal could become a crime. A handshake across racial lines could lead to accusation. A friendship could invite suspicion. The legal code of the South had become a manual for separation, each clause designed to remind one group of its power and the other of its place. Enforcement was relentless. Police officers, judges, and local officials were not merely enforcers of public order, they were guardians of the social hierarchy. Those who dared to challenge the system faced steep fines or imprisonment. But the true punishment often came from outside the courtroom. The threat of retaliation, from neighbors, employers, or vigilante groups, hung over every act of defiance. It was an unspoken warning: stay in line, or pay the price. The cruelty of these laws lay in their precision. They didn't simply separate people, they divided moments, interactions, and memories. A child's first day at school was shaped by a rule about which classroom they could enter. A family outing to a park was governed by a law about which picnic area they could use. Even in death, segregation persisted. Cemeteries kept separate burial grounds, ensuring that the divisions of life followed people into the afterlife. Yet for all their strictness, these laws could not extinguish human resilience. Behind closed doors, families built their own worlds, schools in church basements, businesses that served their communities, and neighborhoods that thrived despite neglect. The very effort to restrict freedom sparked creativity and unity. Out of exclusion came innovation, and out of oppression came strength. The architects of Jim Crow believed that by writing their vision into law, they could make it permanent. But history would prove otherwise. Every rule they passed planted a seed of resistance in the hearts of those it sought to silence. Teachers taught children to question injustice. Preachers spoke of freedom disguised as faith. Workers whispered of change while laboring under signs that told them they did not belong. The laws of segregation were designed to last forever, but they carried within them the blueprint of their own undoing. For every restriction written into law, a quiet rebellion began to take shape, a rebellion that would grow into movements, marches, and voices that refused to be silenced. The era of Jim Crow built a world of boundaries, but it also built a generation that learned how to break them. Beneath the laws and customs of the Jim Crow system, there existed an even darker force, the power of fear. It was not enough to legislate separation, it had to be enforced through terror. Across the South, violence became the unspoken language that kept the system alive. It was a shadow that followed people home, a warning whispered through generations: stay silent, stay small, stay safe. From 1882 to 1968, more than 4,700 documented lynchings took place across America. These were not random acts of cruelty, they were public spectacles meant to send a message. Word would spread through small towns when an accusation was made, and before long, a crowd would gather. People from miles away would come to witness what they believed was justice, though it was anything but. No court, no defense, no mercy, just the raw machinery of fear disguised as order. For those who lived under the shadow of Jim Crow, the threat was constant. A simple misunderstanding, a perceived slight, or even a rumor could place someone in danger. Homes were burned, families were torn apart, and entire communities learned to move cautiously through life, measuring every word and action. The violence was not only physical, it was psychological, a deliberate attempt to remind people that the law did not protect them. And yet, even in that climate of terror, there was defiance. Communities gathered in secret to protect one another, to mourn quietly, and to keep records of what others tried to erase. Churches held prayers for the lost, newspapers written by black journalists risked everything to tell the truth, and parents taught their children that they were more than what the world told them to be. Every act of remembrance became an act of resistance. The story of Jim Crow is not just a story of oppression, it's a story of endurance. It reveals how cruelty can shape a society, but also how courage can endure in silence. Though the system was built to break spirits, it never succeeded in extinguishing hope. From those dark years rose the voices that would lead a nation toward change, voices that demanded justice, not through vengeance, but through truth. Today, when we look back at that time, we do not do so to reopen wounds, but to understand the cost of forgetting. History warns us not only through its victories but through its sorrows. The memory of those years reminds us that progress is never given, it is earned, protected, and passed down like a torch. If you believe stories like this must continue to be told, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can keep history alive, honor those who came before us, and ensure their lessons are never lost. Thank you for watching, and have a peaceful night.